spending time with you at such an early stage of my career. And I hope that I can offer something of value to you. And I must extend a very particular thank you to Professor Bruce Barraclough for his assistance in helping me pull something together which I hope is useful to all the delegates here today. I always like to start where I intend to end, and why say something badly when someone else said it much better than you. Leonard Cohen in his anthem asks us to ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything, but that is how the light gets in. And with that, I hope to establish some kind of cognitive resonance which will allow us to enter into the topics I hope to cover today. I'll start with a very technical term, brain clunk. My neuroscience professor once declared to my class, the brain is an organ of representation. And he repeated it for effect. The brain is an organ of representation. I'm sure he was already aware of the meaning of this extraordinary statement, but the effect of his words was immediate on me. Deep secrets from my formative years, images, memories, stories from books, theories of the multiverse, to name a few, all suddenly shuddered and activated as if to shake me. I realised in that moment that these objects, at once unsynchronised and never considered in relationship, through this magical power of my brain to represent the external world around me, actually shaped my sense of selfhood, my identity, the I that is me in the world. A second example of this brain clunk, which also resonates strongly with the idea of progression of competence, to use a vastly more meaningful phrase. It occurred during my ethics training. I always had a very ambivalent relationship with ethics right from my earliest days in medical school, and this became personified in a particular professor. And on this day, we were trying to use principlism to divine the moral action of some dilemma or something we were trying to decide. And he only concluded at the end that by turning the whole process into a process, we may actually have already compromised our conclusions. But instead, as in the past, of experiencing intellectual indignation, instead I was shocked because a veil lifted. All ethics, no matter how you construct it, is immanently and indivisibly linked with the people who are talking, arguing, and agreeing their way to some kind of conclusion or decision. It's not a lofty set of abstracted ideas, but somehow they're linked. So today, you might have gathered, I hope to take us into a brief relationship with symbols, patterns, and meaning, so that we might, in a short amount of time, come to share something of a sense of making of meaning of fit professionals in healthcare, their importance, their value, and the promotion of them in service to health systems and to the citizens. This begins with a disambiguation of what we actually mean by health and care, leading to what I hope is a better definition of the roles of the institutions and individuals that make up our healthcare systems. Such a journey requires some intellectual leaps. I hope you can trust me to land us relatively safely on the side, but I am an amateur observer, so I hope you forgive me a stumble or two along the way. We will consider the Emperor Hadrian, Hofstadter and Gödel, among others, as I try to explore the conflict arising in healthcare when these terms are thoughtlessly combined in their symbols and meaning. If all goes well, we should end up with some idea of how a renewed perspective of this symbolism and meaning functions to inform the actors taking part on what I will come to explain is the fitness landscape of modern healthcare. I'll argue today that if my task was to define the fit professional, it is by its very manifestation a difficult thing to do. For what defines fitness in a rural surgeon in country Victoria versus a physician in a tertiary hospital in metropolitan Melbourne may look and feel quite different. My argument for this position arises from the observation that the context and meaning which defines fitness in each of these cases cannot be formed from a strict adherence to a carbon copy. It requires, as we've heard over and over again today, distinct alterations and adaptations. There's almost certainly a shared set of descriptors that might be applied in a comparative sense, but this does not in itself equal the definition of the fit professional, because in each context it's not the same. And of course, this is to say nothing of the individuals that actually take on these roles, their qualities, strengths and vulnerabilities. I'm confident enough to say that I'm in no position today to say this or that is what defines a fit professional. But by the end of the presentation, I hope you'll agree with me somewhat on that statement. T.S. Eliot observed in a paper he wrote in 1948 towards the definition of culture, a very interesting and relevant feature of the use of the word culture. In general, the word is used in two ways, as a kind of synecdoche, when the speaker has in mind one of the elements of what he's talking about, such as art, or as a kind of emotional stimulant or anaesthetic. When we bring health and care to mind, we typically experience a pattern of meaning in which the terms are axiomatically linked. In my mind, they're separable objects that, for reasons other than the speed of communication, we put together. Our experiential lives of ourselves and our patients provides inexhaustible fodder to prove that that's not necessarily the case. On a recent visit, stories are always good, on a recent visit to an unnamed tertiary referral centre with my brother-in-law, who had a very nasty head strike and developed quite significant meningism, including photophobia, stiff neck, well, I don't need to describe it for you. We discovered that the execution of health priorities can absolutely be delivered without a modicum of care. And when he walked out of that emergency department at 5 o'clock in the morning, he didn't thank anybody. He was left with a very nasty headache after his lumbar puncture, wondering why everyone had been so heartless when he'd been so vulnerable. On the other side, I'm reminded of health and care, of the experience described by Marguerite Yourcenar in her quasi-biographical work, The Memoirs of Hadrian. In his dying days, some 3,000 years ago, suffering from a dropsical heart, Hadrian judges the activities of his personal physician Hermogenes, who was alarmed in spite of himself at the rapid progress of disease. He concludes that all the magical potions presented to him are of little value, but they had been given with the right intentions of a physician who had put the emperor's needs, and by definition, the citizen's needs, before his own. There was so much care, but without manifest improvement in health, or as the later meant, his death. Now, I didn't hear a hear or a cheer from the audience when this popped up earlier today. I expected better from my Canadian friends, having travelled there, so hear, can meds. I'll argue, you'll be familiar with can meds and the medical expert framework. Not surprisingly to my mind, the domains outlined are a mix of both health and care symbols and patterns. So whilst the consummate expression of the fit professional might be a successful manifestation of the medical expert in all its parts, the framework supports a conclusion that the objects of health and care can occupy different domains of expression. And I've attempted to stylise that with the Venn diagram next to it, where we have the domains of health and care, and I have lifted the facets from the different domains as expressed in medical expertise and shown that it can be separated out. And an interesting phenomenon takes place where health and care crosses over, and we'll come back to that shortly. One further foundational conjecture I must make in order to say something successful about the fit professional is my argument that at core there is a conflict of agency between what's called the Ten Commandments syndrome and what Ed Murrows and others have called the last 3 feet of communication. In my estimation on the whole, caring very much occurs in the domain of the last 3 feet of communication. It's that interpersonal realm where two humans interact psychologically, emotionally and physically in pursuit of some shared meaning or goal. For my bet, health at least, in its modern iteration, is much more inclined to be understood from an application of an abstracted set of outcomes and outputs, or as I term it, commandments, with mathematically definable symbols and patterns. Commandmentism in health is found in activities from evidence-based medicine to treatment protocols to 4-hour emergency department goals. Much like health, what constitutes the fit professional also tends towards commandmentism. If indeed all that was required to ensure our fitness was a comprehensive list of do's and don'ts, and we've established it's not particularly effective. And I wouldn't need to be here because the 30 years of research that preceded me would have given us all the answers that we need. I'm actually going to truncate any further review of this aspect of fitness because I don't believe it will bear much fruit beyond what is already established dogma. Get your own GP, take your holidays, exercise, and my very favourite, develop a work-life balance. I believe our best path is much greater appreciation of the context of the fit professional in their environment and in relationship to their patients. The Ten Commandments was an early tradition attempting social organisation around a set of indisputable truths. They were indisputable because they were from God. What's my favourite? The fifth. Anyone remember what the fifth commandment is? Oh God, a bunch of heathens. I was brung up Catholic, I know what the fifth is. Thou shalt not kill. What a nice sentence. It's a declarative sentence that an 8 or 9-year-old can understand and, more importantly, can apply. Thank God for lawyers. No, it's okay. Oh, we've got an eminent one in the audience somewhere. Without whom this simple statement could not have evolved into the thousand-fold mitigations, rationalisations, degrees and punishments. How is it possible that self-evident truth should so readily twist and turn? Well, my answer is twofold. Firstly, there is no divine truth. And by that I mean an indisputable set of laws that functions at all levels and layers of the universe. Secondly, at a social level we might find the possibility of distilling a seemingly inalienable set of truths. But at the far grainier level of the interpersonal, any truth falls foul of the ethicist's observation, it all depends. It's not because there's some untruth about our commandment. It's because in the interpersonal domain, a new dimension of meaning-making emerges. In the sense of the patient-doctor relationship, to quote Paul Komisarov, who's an eminent ethicist here in Melbourne, the relationship occurs in a region of the infinite array of infinitesimal events that make up the interpersonal encounter. A helpful analogy to why commandmentism isn't necessarily going to save us, but why it is also very important, is established in Douglas Hofstadter's work on consciousness and the mathematical theory of Gödel's incompleteness. I'm not going to paraphrase the work, so I rely in part on your faith that I'm not selectively quoting. But for the purposes of this argument, I'm drawing on aspects of his thesis relating to self-referencing within organic systems and the emergence of consciousness. He shows that by generating iteration after iteration of loops of logical building blocks, and we might consider that neuronal networks, they can become sufficiently complex to allow an awareness of self to arise, and that this is only possible when the rules that govern the loops are incomplete. The image on the left, taken from Citizen Kane, is a great example of how you can experience an infinite loop in your own life. Just stand between two mirrors and you get this effect. On the other side, we've got the drawing by M.C. Escher of his hands drawing each other. This is equivalent to what is called the chicken and egg paradox. How can one hand be drawing the other hand when it requires a hand in the first instance to be drawn? This incompleteness causes a paradox, and paradoxes are powerful. Under these circumstances, a new level of meaning-making is required to resolve the problem. This pressure to find new levels of generating understanding is fundamental to the effectiveness of fitness landscapes, which I'll shortly describe. But just like our mathematical friends, I sense there's a preference to try and build a foundation for the organisation of healthcare from a set of indisputable axioms. This is the Ten Commandments syndrome, the tendency to attempt to codify at macro scales, a set of truths that must be observed by individual players down there on their fitness landscape. I've observed at the interpersonal level that one can actually honour the symbolism of a commandment, but produce decisions as a function of caring that are equally truthful, but in contradiction to the intention of the commandment. And that's a paradox I hope to resolve later. But why does care matter? And how is it manifested? Well, thankfully we don't need to look much further than CanMeds again. In their preamble, the group states that fundamentally CanMeds is an initiative to improve patient care. Care is not a secondary or tertiary outcome, it's the primary outcome. Why? Why not aspire to fundamental improvement in health metrics by whatever means necessary? Surely with enough expenditure and research, we could codify all the essential processes to bring health outcomes within normal, definable goals of the population. Or are we saying that improved patient health metrics is equivalent to improved care? If you listen to the vast majority of conversations on busy hospital rounds, you'd be forgiven for having formed the view that health metrics is a fundamental ambition of treating teams. But our learned peers have endorsed care as the primary outcome. So are these objects equivalent, synonymous, paradoxical, or something else? Hadrian, in true Roman logic, resolved that the virtue of care, expressed by his long-time physician, forgives all manner of futile treatments. As a result of this care, he even wishes to avoid homogeneous the embarrassment of the emperor's own suicide by seeking a death potion from another doctor. In short, care is necessarily about the interpersonal, the professional in relationship to the patient. And I'm not giving much away, and we've heard plenty of evidence already today, that collectively, at present, in the estimation of our patients, we stink somewhat in their estimation of our care, despite the fact that we don't appear, in my view, to be any worse at executing health improvements. We don't need to look much further than the opinion pages of the local newspapers as a result of the Victorian nurses' strike, where all manner of other complaints are being raised on those pages. I said earlier that care is fundamentally about the professional in relationship to the patient. I suspect our troubles to date reflect the least good choice of measuring what care looks like, how it's experienced, who's responsible for it, and the impact of this on its relationship to outcomes. Secondly, I'll argue that care as a concept itself is now its own synecdoche. It's an over-interpreted concept whose meaning and application are too indistinct to make it truly understandable. It would be wonderful if there was a black box of care that did in fact reflect the success of a health system and its practitioners, and I'm by no means arguing against the need for care, far from it. My challenge is to its current formulation and role in systemic quality management. It's troublesome because it influences our understanding and measurement of fitness of our professionals. If we return to canned meds, we see the ultimate outcome criterion as improved patient care. In my estimation, this is the rub. If there are a couple fundamentals of the human experience, it's that it's usually vague, relatively unconscious, and even fickle. And all of that's at the best of times. Patients can be self-centred, greedy for time and attention, and unrealistically demanding of our expertise. So how can a whole system of organisation be measured in its success against the individual, profoundly complex experience of singular patients when such conditions prevail? Hopefully, in this last section of my presentation, I'll pull together some of these arguments and threads to establish the context and role and value of fit professionals in the life of the health system and the care of our patients. I'll undertake the effort by dividing my thinking along the lines of the players who take part on the fitness landscape, which you'll see shortly. That's government and bureaucracy, the learned colleges, medical education, and finally, the clinical encounter. Here's a fitness landscape. This one's describing the fitness landscape, or in a computational model, of a theoretical gene A versus a theoretical gene B. It's relatively self-explanatory and it's not simplifying the concept. Each strand of red running in each direction is some element or expression of that gene and its influence on the population who sit below the curves. Or, as we can see near gene B, in low fitness, actually suck populations down. In traditional Westminster systems, there's a preference for separation of procurement and delivery in order to create checks and balances to promote, among other things, value for money and accountability. In Australia, we're on the threshold of a major reorganisation of our funding arrangements, and it's well beyond the scope of my talk to talk about that. And I think most of you would have some very valuable insights from your own experience into the importance of resourcing by bureaucracies to maintain workable systems of health and care. But again, that's a debate for another time. In the theme of my presentation, I'd like to venture that no matter where funding arises, it's not in the bureaucracy's best interests to involve itself in the individual lives of its citizens. When this does happen, we can be fairly confident 50% of the people, give or take a few, are going to be happy, and 50%, give or take a few, aren't going to be happy. Instead, I propose that a government will benefit maximally within health systems by focusing mainly on its strengths. That's redistribution and coordination of resources, purchasing power to drive efficiencies and support innovation, and lower order gatekeeping of community level interests in professional standards and accreditation. It's not an exhaustive list, but it does set out what I hope are a set of boundaries within this fitness landscape. So going back to our diagram, the edges of our diagram are not abstracted edges. They represent a boundary established by the organisation of the systems playing on that landscape. It's my contention that governments and bureaucracies function best at the axiomatic level, the commandment level, and that they can shape the landscape by the judicious use of axioms, generating higher order change within smaller units of the system. But there is a distinct and necessary limit to how deeply they can reach into those smaller units of activity. Except in extreme circumstances, the value of intervention, for example, in the practicing life of an individual practitioner, is grossly outweighed by the consumption of resources that might have been better distributed elsewhere. I repeat, in the extremes of circumstances, there's a role for that. An example of bureaucratic reach that's generating much debate at the moment is this 4-hour emergency room department target. The timescale, 4 hours, is distinctly within the operating limits of the interpersonal, and it's being used to measure aspects of larger system efficiency and value for money. The jury remains out somewhat on the overall value of 4-hour rules, and I'm not here to argue for or against it, but I am attempting to offer insight into how governments might best exert their boundary building influences across the landscape. In general, when the boundaries are clear, consistent, and within right limits, the individual actors, whether they're local area health networks or individual practitioners, can create a much better detailed map of the landscape in which they're operating and, in fact, adjust their activities accordingly. The manner in which that adjustment occurs can be both positive and negative. The directionality of change is powerfully linked to a range of factors which we've heard some of today, including punishment and reward systems. These exert an enormous amount of pressure in different locations across the landscape. No one really believes that a bureaucracy can possibly understand their individual circumstances, and governments shouldn't be so arrogant to think that they do. But they do have power to shape the directionality of change because of their larger organisational influences. If we turn our minds to the